Hi, I'm here again with Jeff Cranford, the president of Links Players International, and we are moving through studies in spiritual due diligence, and we are on the third study, the nature of God, the fourth lesson now, which is the second lesson in looking at God incarnate, at Jesus. And in the last lesson, we talked about Jesus' life leading up to his death, some of the things that are significant about that. What about his death and resurrection? What makes that such a powerful and critical piece of the Christian faith?
Well, in one sense, I can describe to you kind of, systematically why it's important. But in one sense, I don't know. I don't understand why God had to die for his creation. And that's one of those eternal paradoxes. I mean, I don't completely understand the plans of God. As I see them kind of back, and even though I don't see them in maybe their fullness of what I'll understand in eternity one day, I'm awed by it. It's fascinating. I mean, it does make sense to me on so many different levels on why God would have to lay down his life, because he's a God of justice. We talk about justice. I was thinking about this even yesterday, Jeff. We talk about how unjust having a just God is. I mean, we really talk about how unfair it would be if God were to really enact justice. And yet, almost everything we see throughout our culture, we're demanding justice. I don't care whether a person's an atheist or an agnostic or anything. They demand justice. There's justice politically. This guy's a fraud. He's a hypocrite. There's justice for child abuse. There's justice whether it be, abuse within whatever area. There's justice in genocide. There's justice in nations and countries and people groups. There should be justice with unfair taxation. There should be justice now for Wall Street with Occupy Wall Street and the fraud that's been being perpetrated, or at least being believed by those who are part of that movement. And we so demand justice, and yet the only person that really can adequately judge is the one that's perfect and the creator of all things, and that's not skewed in his views of what's right and what's wrong. And then yet we call it unjust when he in some way seems to say there's justice needed here. And yet what's even more fascinating is that there's justice that needs to be done here, and yet he takes the penalty upon himself to make sure this justice is done for those who would simply believe and understand that. And so I think what's so fascinating to me about the fact that God would go to the cross, and it's been written about, I mean, obviously you can go back into the Tanakh, God's been making this plan before the fall, I believe, that these plans were in place before the fall in Genesis chapter 3, already in place, that God had already determined that he was going to make right what was going to be wrong, having given free will to humankind. And so he wasn't waiting around to wonder if this would occur, but that he was going to solve it and bring the justice himself and incur it himself. And so through the Passover week and through all the feasts, and God has spoken, as Paul told the Hebrews, he's spoken in many different ways, in many different forms, over and over, saying the same thing, is that justice is going to happen. I'm going to take it upon myself. I'm going to take the curse upon myself to make things right again with man. And again, as you see that unfolding in perfect harmony with everything that had been written, not just specific prophecies, but in type and shadow and every other way, and watching God pay the price for his failed creation, what can you say? I mean, you can say it's absurd, it's ridiculous, it doesn't make sense. Or you can go deeper and you can begin to really do your spiritual due diligence and find, as many have found, that no, in fact, it is happened exactly according to the pattern. And it's one of the most intellectually compelling things on the face of the planet. I'll tell you this one little thing. I was spending some time with a very close friend of mine who's a very well-known physician, part of one of the big, there's not the New England Journal of Medicine, but it's one of its, it was one of the chief editors of that as well, writes op-ed for the Washington Post and New York Times and everything. And he said of all the various research that they get in on these medical studies, they get all this research in, and then it's just nitpicking, and finally you get an article in one of these great medical journals of which physicians will make actual pronouncements and change their practice based upon these. So it's great scrutiny before all, and these guys work years and devote their lives into getting these articles published. He says even after they get into periodicals, these journals, after a period of 5 or 10 years, maybe 85% are deemed to be inaccurate later, of the ones after having gone through all the scrutiny. And it kind of brings up this, well, how do we ever get to truth? You know, people always frustrated. This year, this causes cancer. Next year, we find out, you know, eggs were terrible for our hearts, and now we find out they're great for our skin and our brain, and they're not as bad as they thought. And cholesterol, and what is it, and all these different things. We wonder how our information and our knowledge base is constantly changing, science constantly changing. What we'll believe in 20 years, what we believe today and what we believe in 20 years it'll be silly. We'll look back and think we walked in silliness now, and yet we say now that science has disproven God. I mean, it's crazy. And so our knowledge, what can we know is truth? Well, when I see something written in advance and then see it being fulfilled over and over and over in so many different ways, it's so and then see the consistency of that truth working across culturally, all in different parts of the world. The Great Wall of China came down, and we didn't even know there were Christians, and now millions and millions of Chinese Christians were back there, and they're looking and sounding and acting just like Jesus, just like it's intellectually compelling, and it's knowledge that we can sink our teeth into. Well, I want to sink you have to sink your teeth into something, unless you're just a nihilist or something. You have to buy into something. And as I've done my due diligence, and millions of others have done their due diligence on Jesus, it makes sense. And the crucifixion and his resurrection make it ever more stabilizing in my mind that I bought into the right thing.